You don't survive 5 years as the right hand to a monster by having a soft heart. Clara Ara knew the rules. She cleaned his blood, hid his secrets, and swallowed her feelings. But when Arthur looked her in the eyes and delivered the final killing blow, not with a bullet, but with 5 quiet words, she didn't cry. She just packed her bags. This is what happens when a king throws away his queen, only to realize he's already lost the board. The study smelled of copper-stale scotch and the sharp ozone tang of a coming storm. Arthur sat behind the mahogany desk, heavy and still staring at the tumbler of liquor in his hand, as if it held the answers to the city's shifting territories. Blood, not his own, flaked dry into the cuffs of his tailored shirt. Clara Ara stood by the doorway. She held a damp towel and a clean change of clothes. She didn't hover. Hovering got people shot in this house. The Maroney brothers left through the south gate. Clara Ara said her voice was flat professional, the perfect instrument for a woman who spent her life orchestrating the survival of a crime boss. I've wired the agreed amount to their offshore account. The docs are yours. Arthur didn't look up. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the scotch. And the leak handled, she replied. She didn't elaborate. Handling it had involved a phone call to a man who charged by the hour and brought his own lie. She stepped forward, placing the clean shirt on the edge of his desk. You should change. The police commissioner is expecting you at the charity gala in 2 hours. You can't smell like a slaughterhouse. Arthur finally lifted his eyes. They were a pale, washed-out grey, the colour of dirty ice. There was a time, maybe 3 years ago, when Clara Ara thought she saw warmth in them. That was the year he took a bullet to the shoulder. And she spent 4 days sleeping in a hard plastic chair beside his bed, waking up every 2 hours to change his bandages because he trusted no one else. He had looked at her then, feverish and delirious, and touched her wrist. A mistake. A hallucination. But it was the hook that had kept her bleeding for him ever since. Cancel the gala, Arthur muttered. I can't, Clara Ara said, her tone dipping into a quiet insistence. If you don't show, the commissioner will think the dock deal went south. He'll look into the Maroney meeting. You need to be seen smiling. I said, cancel it. Arthur slammed the glass down. The amber liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the blotter. Clara Ara didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a linen handkerchief, and stepped forward to wipe the spill. It was muscle memory. Clean up the mess. Fix the problem. Protect Arthur. Her fingers brushed his knuckles. He jerked his hand back, as if she carried a disease. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Clara Ara froze, the damp handkerchief hovering over the mahogany. She looked at his face. The tension in his jaw was rigid. His expression twisted into something resembling disgust. It wasn't the disgust of a man tired of his work. It was directed entirely at her. Stop, Arthur said. The word was quiet, but it echoed in the cavernous room. Just stop. Stop what? Clara Ara asked, lowering her hand, hovering, smothering. He leaned back, the leather chair groaning under his weight. Looking at me like that? Clara Ara kept her face utterly blank. Looking at you like what? Like you're owed something? He spat the exhaustion of the night, finally stripping away his veneer of control. He stood up, towering over her, casting a long, jagged shadow across the Persian rug. You think because you know my schedules, because you clean up my messes, that you have a claim. You look at me like a stray dog waiting for a scrap. The words hit her like physical blows right in the sternum. Clara Ara's breath hitched just a fraction of a second, but she forced her spine iron straight. I am your assistant, Arthur. I look at you like an employer who is about to make a tactical error. Don't lie to me. He closed the distance between them. He was cruel now. It was the same cold, dissecting cruelty he used on rivals tied to chairs in damp basements. He saw her weakness, and he was going to excise it. I see it every time you bring me a drink. Every time you patch me up, you think there's something here. You think your loyalty buys you a seat at the table, or worse, a place in my bed. Clara Ara felt the heat rise to her cheeks, a flush of profound, agonizing humiliation. She had never asked for a thing. She had never spoken a word of the pathetic, quiet devotion she carried. Arthur, she started, her voice finally trembling, I never loved you. The sentence hung in the air. 5 words. Brutal, efficient, final. Arthur watched her, his grey eyes locked on hers, waiting for the break. You are an employee, a highly paid secretary. You manage my calendar. You do not manage me. Do not confuse usefulness with importance. If you died tomorrow, I would replace you by Tuesday. Clara Ara stared at him. The roar of the coming rain finally broke outside, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Something inside her chest didn't just break. It evaporated. The tether she had held on to for 5 years, the justification for the late nights, the compromised morals, the blood on her shoes simply vanished. She looked at the man she had sacrificed her 20s for. He wasn't a tortured king. He was just an empty, vicious suit. She slowly folded the stained handkerchief and placed it neatly next to the empty glass. Understood, Clara Ara said. No tears, no raised voice. She turned on her heel, the sharp click of her stilettos ringing against the hardwood floor. Where are you going? Arthur demanded, annoyed by the lack of a fight. You still have to brief me on tomorrow's drops. Clara Ara paused at the door. She didn't look back. Read the file, Arthur. It's on your desk. She walked out, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her. The click of the latch was the loudest sound Arthur had heard all night. Clara Ara's apartment was a reflection of her life, with Arthur, immaculate, functional, and devoid of warmth. It was a company-paid penthouse 4 blocks from his estate, chosen for its proximity, not its comfort. She walked into the bedroom, pulled a black duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet, and laid it on the mattress. She didn't pack the designer dresses Arthur bought her for the galas. She didn't pack the expensive jewelry meant to make her look like a piece of his success. She packed 3 pairs of jeans, a handful of plain shirts, a heavy jacket, and a pair of worn-out boots she hadn't touched in half a decade. From the false bottom of her nightstand, she extracted a thick manila envelope. Inside were passports that didn't bear the name Clara Ara Hughes, and $80,000 in untraceable cash. She had started building this safety net 3 years ago, just after the bullet incident. A cynical insurance policy she hoped she would never need. She walked into the bathroom, grabbed her toothbrush, and stopped in front of the mirror. She looked tired. The skin under her eyes was bruised with exhaustion. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly, her scalp arched. She reached up and pulled the pins out, letting her hair fall around her shoulders. She barely recognized the woman looking back. "I never loved you." The words echoed in her skull. She pressed her palms flat against the cold porcelain sink, took one long, shaky breath, and locked the emotion away behind a heavy steel door in her mind. Mourning was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Leaving a man like Arthur Costello wasn't a resignation. It was an escape. She grabbed the burner phone from her purse, snapped it in half, and tossed it into the trash. By 3 a.m., the duffel bag was in the trunk of a used sedan registered to a ghost. She drove west into the rain, watching the skyline of the city she had helped Arthur rule fade into the rearview mirror. Morning broke over the Costello estate with a dull grey light. Arthur woke up at 6:30 a.m., exactly as he always did. He walked downstairs, rubbing the stiff muscle in his neck. The house was dead quiet. Usually, by this time, there was the faint scent of dark roast coffee and the sound of a pen scratching across paper in the dining room. The dining room was empty. The mahogany table was bare. Arthur frowned. He walked into the kitchen. The coffee pot was cold. Gregory. Arthur barked, his voice rough with sleep. A heavy-set man in an ill-fitting suit hurried into the kitchen. Gregory was Arthur's underboss, great with a tire iron, terrible with details. "Boss, morning?" Gregory said, looking nervously around. "Where's Clara?" Arthur asked, opening the fridge and staring blankly at the shelves. "She usually has the morning briefing ready, and my coffee." Gregory shifted his weight. "Oh, she ain't here, boss." Arthur closed the fridge. "Did she go to the warehouse?" "No, I mean she ain't here. Her car is not in the driveway. Her office is locked." Gregory swallowed hard. "I tried calling her at 7 o'clock. Go straight to voicemail." A flicker of annoyance tightened Arthur's jaw. She was pouting. He had been harsh last night. Yes, but they were adults in a brutal business. He didn't have time for a tantrum. "Get a spare key. Open her office. Find the drop schedules for the West Side," Arthur ordered, walking back toward his study. "And call her again. Tell her she has 30 minutes to get her ass here before I dock her pay." 10 minutes later, Arthur was sitting at his desk, staring at the stain on the blot from the scotch. Gregory walked in, holding a single, neatly typed sheet of paper. He looked pale. "What?" Arthur snapped. "I opened the office," Gregory said, holding out the paper. "The schedules ain't there. Her hard drive is wiped. Everything's gone, Arthur. Just dust." Arthur snatched the paper from Gregory's hand. It was a formal resignation printed on standard white paper. No letterhead, no signature to whom it may concern. "Effective immediately, I resign from my position. All current accounts are settled. The ledgers have been forwarded to the secure servers. Do not contact me." Arthur stared at the words, the sheer sterile audacity of it. "To whom it may concern is playing a game," Arthur said quietly, crushing the paper in his fist. "Send 2 guys to her apartment. Drag her back here. I don't care if she's in her pajamas. boss school. Gregory hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I already sent Mickey. He just called. The apartment's cleared out. Furniture's there. But her clothes, her safe gone. Building manager said she left her keys on the counter at 2 a.m. Arthur stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The annoyance evaporated, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar void in his stomach. Clara Ara was gone. Find her, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. Arthur, she knows all the routing numbers. She knows the safe house locations. I said, find her. Arthur roared, sweeping his arm across the desk. The empty tumbler, a stack of files, and a heavy brass lamp crashed to the floor, shattering in the quiet room. Gregory scrambled backward, nodding frantically before fleeing the study. Arthur stood alone in the wreckage, his chest heaving. He looked at the shattered glass on the rug. He had told her she was a calendar with a heartbeat. He had told her she was replaceable. He walked over to the filing cabinet, where Clara Ara kept the daily operations logs. He pulled the drawer open. It was completely empty. Arthur Costello, the man who owned half the city, suddenly realized he didn't even know the passcode to his own bank accounts. By 2:00 p.m., the reality of Clara Ara's absence shifted from a frustrating inconvenience to a structural collapse. Arthur sat at the head of the conference table in the glass-walled boardroom of his legitimate front company, Costello Logistics. 4 union bosses and 2 city councilmen sat opposite him. Usually, Clara Ara sat in the corner chair, her laptop open, seamlessly sliding him a post-it note with the exact names of the councilmen's wives and the precise percentage of the union skim required to grease the wheels. Today the corner chair was empty. Arthur didn't know the councilman's wife's name. He didn't know the agreed-upon skim. He sat in silence, his jaw tight, projecting a menace he didn't entirely feel. He felt blind. Mr. Costello, the older councilman said, clearing his throat. We're just looking for confirmation on the waterfront zoning variances. Your office usually sends over the drafted proposals by Tuesday morning. The proposals are under review. Arthur lied. His voice was smooth. A practiced weapon. You'll have them by the end of the week. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They were sharks. They could smell blood in the water. Even a drop as small as a missed deadline. Arthur Costello didn't miss deadlines. He didn't do under review. The meeting ended 20 minutes later, tense and unresolved. As soon as the heavy glass doors clicked shut behind the politicians, Arthur hurled his heavy crystal water glass at the far wall. It shattered perfectly, raining shards over the expensive carpet. Gregory poked his head in, looking at the mess. He winced. No luck on the street, boss. Nobody's seen her. Her old contacts, the fixers, the cleaners. Nobody's heard a whisper. She didn't go to them, Arthur said, bracing his hands on the table. His breathing was heavy measured. She knows I'd squeeze them. She's gone dark. So what do we do? The Cayman accounts. I'll handle the accounts, Arthur snapped. He wouldn't. He couldn't. Clara Ara had set up a 2-factor authentication system tethered to a server he couldn't even locate, let alone breach. She had built a fortress around his wealth, and then she had walked out with the only key. Find Hayes, Arthur ordered. Bring him to the house tonight. Gregory blanched. The wiretapper boss. He's a freak. He smells like old milk, and he asks too many questions. I don't care if he smells like a corpse. Bring him to me. Arthur grabbed his suit jacket and walked out of the room. He needed a drink. He needed 5. He needed the quiet, steady rhythm of Clara Ara's typing to anchor the chaotic noise in his head. 700 meters away, Clara Ara pulled into the gravel parking lot of a decaying motel in a coastal Oregon town. The neon sign buzzed, flickering a sickly pink light across the hood of her sedan. She turned off the engine. The silence in the car was absolute. For 5 years, her ears had been filled with the sounds of Arthur's world, the sharp crack of gunfire in a warehouse, the low threatening murmur of a negotiation, the clinking of ice in his glass, the heavy measured thud of his boots on hardwood. Now there was only the distant rhythmic crashing of the ocean and the patter of rain against her windshield. Clara Ara gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She waited for the relief. She waited for the feeling of freedom that was supposed to wash over her. Instead, her chest seized. She opened the car door and stumbled out the cold, salty air, hitting her like a physical blow. She barely made it to the edge of the gravel lot before she dropped to her knees in the wet grass. She didn't cry. Crying was a soft thing, and Arthur had burned all the softness out of her. Instead, she dry heaved her body violently, expelling the adrenaline, the fear, and the crushing, humiliating weight of his final words. "I never loved you." She gasped for air, the damp soil soaking through the knees of her jeans. She had been a fool, a competent, highly paid, heavily armed fool. She had built her entire existence around a man who viewed her as a piece of office equipment. After 10 minutes, the spasm stopped. Clara Ara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, stood up and brushed the dirt from her jeans. She walked into the motel lobby, slapped 2 crisp $50 bills on the laminate counter, and signed the register as Diana Vance. Room 14 was a dingy box that smelled of stale cigarettes and pine cleaner. Clara Ara dropped her duffel bag on the sagging mattress. She didn't unpack. She walked to the bathroom, turned on the shower, and stripped off the clothes she had worn when she walked out of Arthur's life. She scrubbed her skin until it was red and raw, trying to wash away the phantom scent of his scotch and the lingering ghost of his presence. Tomorrow, she would find a permanent place. Tomorrow, she would secure a quiet, boring job. Tomorrow, she would begin the arduous process of becoming nobody. But tonight, she lay on top of the cheap bedspread, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, listening to the rain. For the first time in 5 years, her phone didn't ring. It was exactly what she wanted. It was the loneliest sound in the world. 3 weeks later, the Costello estate was running on fumes and fear. Arthur's temper, always a dormant volcano, had fully erupted. He had beaten a mid-level capo half to death with a pool cue for skimming a negligible amount from a nightclub front. An infraction Clara Ara would have handled with a quiet, terrifying tax audit and a demotion. Without her to act as the buffer, Arthur's default response was violence. The house reflected his state of mind. It was messy. The dry cleaning was late. The coffee was bitter. Arthur sat in his study at 3 a.m., the room shrouded in darkness, except for the blue glow of a laptop screen. He wasn't looking at ledgers or shipment routes. He was looking at security footage from the night she left. He played the clip for the 100th time. Clara Ara walking down the hallway, her face impassive, her posture rigid, the way she turned the corner and simply vanished from the frame. He took a sip of scotch. It tasted like ash. The heavy oak door creaked open. Gregory stepped in, looking exhausted. Behind him was Hayes. Hayes was a thin, twitchy man in his 40s who wore oversized glasses and carried a custom-built decryption tower in a battered metal briefcase. "He's got something, boss," Gregory murmured, keeping a safe distance from the desk. Arthur looked up. The fatigue in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. He closed his laptop. "Show me." Hayes skewered forward, placed his briefcase on the desk, and popped the latches. "She's good, Mr. Costello. I mean top-tier paranoid. Wiped the servers, destroyed the physical drives, even scrambled the local cell tower logs for a 3-hour window around her departure. She didn't leave crumbs. She left a vacuum. I don't pay you to admire her," Arthur said softly. "I pay you to find her." Hayes swallowed hard. "Right. Well, you can't erase everything. You can wipe digital footprints, but you can't wipe analog mistakes." I stopped looking at her tech and started looking at her money. Hayes pulled out a printed map and laid it over the stained blotter. She emptied the safety deposit box under the alias Sarah Jenkins. We knew that cash doesn't track, but a ghost still needs to drive. She bought a used sedan in cash from a scrap dealer on the south side 6 months ago. The plates are registered to a dead woman. Arthur leaned forward and she avoided the major highways. Smart, but she had to cross the state line. Hayes pointed a bony finger at a red circle on the map. Toll booth on Route 9. It's an automated system, but they still take photos of the plates. The photo is blurry, and it was raining, but the system flagged the dead woman's plates at 4:12 a.m., the night she left. Hayes tapped the map. She headed west towards the coast. Arthur stared at the red circle. It was a tiny crack in her armor, but it was enough. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a target. "Get a team ready," Arthur told Gregory, not taking his eyes off the map. "We're going west, Arthur." "It's a huge coastline," Gregory protested weakly. "We don't know what state she stopped in, let alone what town." "I know her," Arthur replied. He traced the line of the highway with his finger. "She hates the heat. She likes isolation. She'll pick somewhere cold, somewhere grey, somewhere the locals don't ask questions." He looked up, his grey eyes burning with an intense, unreadable emotion. It wasn't just about the bank codes anymore. The chaos of his current operations was secondary. This was about the empty corner chair. This was about the way the silence in his house was deafening without her. He had told her she was replaceable. He had lied. Clara Ara, now Diana, stood on the wooden deck of the Pelican Marina in Port Haven, Washington. The wind was biting, carrying the sharp scent of diesel and sea salt. She wore a heavy canvas jacket and thick gloves, holding a clipboard as she tallied the monthly slip fees. It was a quiet, blue-collar town. The fishermen drank cheap beer. The local police chief spent his afternoons napping in his cruiser, and nobody cared about a quiet woman who kept the marina's books perfectly balanced. "Hey, Diana," a gruff voice called out. Clara Ara turned. It was Miller, the marina owner. He was a decent man, 50 years old, with bad knees and a mountain of debt. He looked stressed. "The boys from the local union chapter are coming around again tomorrow," Miller said, rubbing his temple. "They're asking for an extra 15% on the dock usage fees. I told them I don't have it. They said they might have to shut off the power to the slips until we figure it out." It was a shakedown. Small time, unrefined, and painfully obvious. Clara Ara looked at the ledger. She saw the numbers. She saw the margins. In Arthur's world, a shakedown like this would end with a union boss taking a long swim with a heavy chain. She felt a familiar cold precision slip into her mind, the safety mechanism clicking off. "Don't pay them," Clara Ara said. Her voice dropped an octave, losing the soft, agreeable tone she had adopted for Port Haven. It was flat and hard. Miller blinked, taken aback. "Diana, if they cut the power, the bait freezers go down. I lose thousands. They won't cut the power," Clara Ara said, making a neat check mark on her clipboard. She looked up at Miller, her eyes dead and calm. "When they show up tomorrow, you tell them you've retained a new legal counsel. Tell them you have a detailed log of their unannounced visits. And if the power goes out, your first call is to the State Labor Board. And your second call is to the IRS regarding their unregistered collection vehicles." Miller stared at her, his mouth slightly open. "Who told you all that?" "I read," Clara Ara said smoothly, the mask slipping right back into place. She offered him a small, polite smile. "Just handle the boats, Mr. Miller. I'll handle the books." She turned back to the docks, the wind whipping her dark hair around her face. She was hiding in plain sight, pretending to be a sheep. But as she watched a grey sedan slowly cruise past the marina gates, hesitating just a second too long before driving on, Clara Ara knew the truth. You can take the woman out of the war, but you can never ever take the war out of the woman. Port Haven was a town painted entirely in shades of grey and rust. The sky hung low, a permanent bruised canopy over the jagged coastline. The air tasted of salt, decaying seaweed, and old diesel fuel. It was a place where people came to be forgotten. Arthur sat in the back of a rented black SUV, watching the rain streak the tinted windows. He looked entirely out of place. His charcoal suit was spun from Italian wool. His shoes were polished calfskin, and his watch cost more than the entire block of bait shops and dive bars they were idling past. "This is the town," Gregory said from the driver's seat, consulting a glowing tablet. Hayes pulled a credit card ping. Not hers. A burner card, bought with cash, registered to a shell company in Delaware, used to buy a bulk order of marine-grade antifreeze. It was shipped to a Port Haven P.O. box. "She hates the cold," Arthur murmured, staring out at a weathered fisherman hauling crab pots. "She hates the smell of fish. She chose this place purely because I would never want to step foot in it." "So, how do we do this?" Gregory asked, looking at Arthur through the rear-view mirror. "We got 4 guys in the trailing car. We can kick down doors, tear the town apart until someone talks." "No," Arthur said. The word was absolute. No kicking down doors. You don't hunt a ghost with a marching band, Gregory. You sit quiet and wait for it to haunt. He opened the door and stepped out into the freezing drizzle. He didn't put up an umbrella. He walked down the cracked sidewalk toward a local diner with fogged-up windows. Inside the diner smelled of burnt coffee and fried onions. Arthur sat in a corner booth, ordering a black coffee from a waitress who looked at his suit with overt suspicion. He drank the bitter sludge and listened. He listened to the complaints of the fishermen, the gossip of the locals. He knew how small towns worked. A stranger arriving and keeping to themselves was a novelty. A stranger who suddenly fixed a failing business was a legend. It took 3 hours. 2 men in heavy Carhartt jackets sat at the counter, nursing cheap beers. I'm telling you, Wyatt, the heavier of the two grumbled. Miller grew a spine overnight. We walked into the marina office, told him the power was getting cut if he didn't cough up the union dues, and he didn't even blink. Miller's a coward, Wyatt replied, wiping his mouth. He probably scraped the cash together. He didn't give us a dime. It wasn't him. It was the new bookkeeper. That quiet brunette. The heavy man shivered, though the diner was warm. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten us with a bat. She just rattled off federal extortion statutes, union charter bylaws, and the exact prison sentences for racketeering. Stared right through me, eyes like 2 pieces of flint. I felt like I was being audited by the devil. Arthur's hand stopped halfway to his coffee cup. He didn't smile. He didn't move. But a sudden, violent jolt of adrenaline spiked through his chest. The ghost had a shape, audited by the devil. It was a perfect description of Clara Urra at work. She had never needed a gun to emasculate a room full of armed men. She just needed a ledger and a quiet voice. Arthur stood up, dropped a $100 bill on the table, and walked out. He pulled his phone from his pocket and hit a speed dial. Gregory Arthur, said the rain soaking his hair, flattening it against his forehead. The Pelican Marina. Tell the boys to lock down the perimeter. No one goes in, no one comes out, but nobody makes a move. You want us to grab her boss? I said, nobody makes a move. Arthur snapped his voice, dropping to a lethal whisper. I'm going in alone. You keep the perimeter secure. If she runs, you let her. If she gets past me, it means I let her. He hung up before Gregory could argue. He walked the 3 blocks to the marina, his expensive shoes crunching against the gravel. The docks were mostly empty, the boats rocking violently against their moorings in the rising tide. At the far end of the lot stood a small white paneled office building. A single light burned in the window. Arthur stopped under the shadow of a rusted, dry dock crane. He watched her through the glass. Clara Urra was sitting at a battered metal desk. She wore a thick grey sweater, her hair pulled up in a messy clip, a yellow pencil tucked behind her ear. She was reviewing a stack of invoices, a steaming mug of tea sitting next to her elbow. She looked tired. She looked ordinary. She looked beautiful. The realization hit Arthur like a physical punch to the ribs. He had spent 5 years treating her like a machine, a flawless, unfeeling mechanism designed to make his life effortless. He had convinced himself that his reliance on her was purely operational. He needed her brain. He needed her organizational skills. He needed her loyalty. But watching her now, drinking cheap tea in a damp office at the edge of the world, Arthur felt a hollow, aching void in his chest that had nothing to do with bank passcodes or dropped shipment schedules. He had lost his empire. Yes, but looking at her, he realized he had lost the only person in the world who actually knew him. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs. He stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the office door. He didn't know what he was going to say. He only knew he wasn't leaving without her. Clara Ara paused her pen, hovering over the final digit of the fuel invoice. The office was quiet, the only sound the hum of the ancient space heater at the corner. But the air in the room had changed. It was a subtle shift in pressure, a prickle of electricity at the nape of her neck. It was the same instinct that used to wake her up 3 seconds before a rival crew shot out the windows of Arthur's estate. She didn't look up. She casually lowered the pen, opened the top right drawer of her desk, and rested her hand on the cold steel of a snub-nosed .38 revolver. The front door clicked open. A gust of freezing rain-soaked air swept into the room, blowing a loose receipt off the desk. Clara Ara slowly lifted her eyes. Arthur stood in the doorway. He was drenched. The expensive Italian wool of his suit was ruined, heavy, and dark with rainwater. His face was paler than she remembered the shadows under his grey eyes. Stark and deep, he looked less like a king and more like a man who had survived a shipwreck. For 5 seconds, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. They just stared at each other across 15 feet of scuffed linoleum. Clara Ara's heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. But she forced her breathing to remain slow and even. She kept her hand in the drawer, her finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. She had spent 5 years mastering the art of an unreadable face. She wasn't about to break now. "You found me," Clara Ara said. Her voice was perfectly neutral. No fear, no surprise, just a statement of fact. Arthur closed the door behind him. The lock clicked. "You made it difficult. That was the point." He took a step forward. Clara Ara didn't pull the gun, but she shifted her weight at the subtle movement, stopping him in his tracks. "The accounts are frozen." "Clara Ara," Arthur said. His voice was rough, scraping against the silence of the room. "The Caymans, the Swiss ledgers, you changed the authentication protocols. I have $50 million locked behind a digital wall, and my underbosses are starting to ask questions I can't answer." "The money is safe," she replied, her tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "The protocols require dual authorization. I set a dead man's switch before I left. If I don't log in every 30 days, the funds automatically transfer to a series of blind trusts. You won't go broke, Arthur. You just have to wait." Arthur stared at her. He had expected anger. He had expected fear or bargaining or tears. He hadn't expected this sheer, impenetrable wall of indifference. "I don't care about the waiting," he said, taking another step. He was closer now. She could smell the rain on him mixed with the faint, expensive scent of cedar and scotch. "I care that you dismantled my life in 3 hours." "I resigned," Clara Ara corrected calmly. "I left the files on your desk. I ensured your immediate survival. My obligations to you were fulfilled. Your obligations. Arthur laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. You were mine. You don't get to just walk away. I was your employee, Clara Ara said. The words tasted like ash, but she forced them out, weaponizing his own cruelty. I managed your calendar. I cleaned your messes. Do not confuse usefulness with importance. If I died, you were going to replace me by Tuesday. I simply moved the timeline up. Arthur flinched. It was a tiny movement, a microscopic tightening of his jaw. But Clara Ara saw it. The words he had thrown at her like acid were now eating through his own armor. I was angry, Arthur said, his voice dropping. The commanding aura of the Mafia boss was slipping, revealing something fractured underneath. The Moroni deal was falling apart. I was bleeding. I said things to push you away. You succeeded? Clara Ara, look at me. I am looking at you, she said, her grip tightening on the revolver hidden in the drawer. She needed to anchor herself to the steel, because looking into his grey eyes was pulling her back into the undertow. And I am telling you to leave. Arthur ignored her. He walked right up to the edge of the desk, planting his hands on the battered metal. He leaned in his face, inches from hers. I said, I never loved you. Arthur whispered the words, ragged and desperate. I lied. The silence in the office became absolute. The space heater hummed. The rain beat against the glass. Clara Ara looked at him. 5 years of secret yearning. 5 years of patching his wounds and hiding his sins, all for the hope that he might look at her this way. It was the exact sentence she had sacrificed her 20s to hear. And now, hearing it, she felt nothing but a profound, exhausting sadness. I know you lied, Arthur, Clara Ara said softly. Arthur exhaled a shaky breath of relief, reaching across the desk to touch her face. Clara Ara leaned back out of his reach. She slid the drawer shut with a sharp metallic slam. I know you lied. She repeated, her voice steady and devastatingly clear. But the fact that you used it as a weapon to break me is exactly why I will never go back. You don't love me, Arthur. You just love what I bleed for you. Arthur froze his hand, hovering over the desk. The arrogance, the desperate hope, all of it drained from his face, leaving him looking hollowed out. I can change, he said. It sounded like a plea. Arthur Costello never pleaded. You are exactly who you need to be to survive your world, Clara Ara said, standing up. She grabbed her coat from the back of the chair. But I don't live in that world anymore. The accounts will unlock in 27 days. Go home, Arthur. Arthur watched her walk past him, the scent of her clean soap rain, and the faint metallic tang of the coastal air brushed against his senses, sharp and familiar. His hand twitched at his side. Every instinct he had cultivated over a lifetime in the underworld screamed at him to reach out, to grab her arm, to assert control. He was a man who dictated terms. He did not ask for permission. He took. But as he looked at the rigid line of her shoulders, the absolute tension humming in her spine, his hand fell back to his side. If he touched her now, it wouldn't be a reclamation. It would be a confirmation of every horrible thing she had just accused him of. Clara Ara reached the door, turned the knob, and stepped out into the freezing rain. The yard was no longer empty. 4 black SUVs were parked in a tight semicircle, effectively boxing in her battered sedan and the marina exit. Their headlights cut bright, blinding swaths through the darkness, illuminating the heavy sheets of rain. 5 men in dark coats stood in the downpour, spaced out in a textbook tactical spread. Gregory stood dead center, directly between Clara Ara and her car. He had his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He didn't look menacing, just deeply uncomfortable. But the men flanking him had their jackets unzipped, their hands resting near their waistbands. Clara Ara stopped on the small wooden porch of the office. She didn't show surprise. She didn't panic. She slowly slid her right hand into the deep pocket of her canvas coat, her fingers wrapping around the cold grip of the .38 revolver. She thumbed the hammer back. The small, deadly click was swallowed by the roar of the ocean and the drumming rain. "Diana," Gregory called out using her alias. His voice was tired, devoid of malice. "Just get back inside. Let's not do this out in the wet." "Move your car, Gregory," Clara Ara said. Her voice carried over the storm flat and perfectly steady. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. "You know I can't do that." Gregory sighed, shaking his head. "Boss says nobody moves." "Nobody moves. Come on. Don't make the boys get rough. Your family." "I was an employee," Clara Ara corrected, stepping off the porch and onto the gravel. The crunch of her boots sounded unnaturally loud, and I quit. "Move the car." 2 of the men shifted their weight, their hands sliding inside their jackets. They didn't know Clara Ara the way Gregory did. They only knew she was a target, holding up their boss's money. To them, she was a civilian, a loose end. Clara Ara kept walking. 15 feet, 10 feet. The distance closed. She calculated the angles. She could put a bullet in the closest man's knee pivot and use the hood of the sedan for cover before the others cleared leather. It would be messy. She would likely take a round to the arm or shoulder, but she would make it to the water. Clara Ara. Arthur's voice sliced through the tension. He stepped out of the office, the door slamming shut behind him. He walked to the edge of the porch, the rain instantly soaking him again. He didn't look at his men. His pale grey eyes were locked entirely on her. "Stand down," Arthur said. The command was absolute devoid of anger. Gregory blinked, rain dripping from his heavy brow. "Boss, she's got the keys to the accounts. We let her walk the capos back home. We're going to start breaking things." I said, "Stand down, Gregory," Arthur repeated. He took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling heavily. "Get in the cars. Move them." The men hesitated, glancing at Gregory. In their world, letting the prize walk away was a sign of weakness. It was blood in the water. Arthur knew it. Clara Ara knew it. "Arthur," Gregory warned softly, "you let her drive away. You're telling the whole city you lost your nerve." Arthur finally turned his gaze to his underboss. The look in his eyes was so profoundly empty, so utterly devoid of the old arrogant fire, that Gregory instinctively took a step back. "Move the cars, Gregory," Arthur whispered, the lethal edge returning to his voice. "Or I will shoot you myself." Gregory swallowed hard. He nodded once sharply and gestured to the men. "Back in the rides, clear the gate." The men slowly backed away, climbing into the idling SUVs, the engine's revved tires spinning against the wet gravel as they backed up, parting like a heavy black curtain to reveal the exit. Clara Ara stood motionless in the rain. She didn't relax her grip on the revolver. She watched Arthur. She looked for the trap. She looked for the angle, the manipulation, the secondary play. There had to be a play. But Arthur just stood on the porch, his hands empty at his sides. "I won't follow you," Arthur said. His voice was barely audible over the idling engines, but she caught every word. "I won't send anyone else. The 27 days I'll manage. You have my word." Clara Ara stared at him. The word of a Mafia boss was a fragile, dangerous thing. But looking at the man shivering on the porch, stripped of his pride and his control, she realized he wasn't speaking as a boss. He was just a man surrendering. She pulled her hand out of her pocket, leaving the gun behind. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say goodbye. She walked to her sedan, got in, and started the engine. She threw it into gear and drove out of the Pelican Marina, the red tail lights cutting through the fog, until she disappeared down the coastal highway. Arthur watched the empty road for a long time. The rain plastered his hair to his skull. His expensive suit clung to him like a wet shroud. "Boss," Gregory called softly from the window of the lead SUV. "We got to go. It's a long drive back." Arthur didn't move. "I tore it all down," he said to the empty night. "I tore it all down for nothing." He finally turned his shoes, dragging against the gravel, and climbed into the back of the SUV. The door slammed shut, sealing him in the dark. The return to the city was brutal. Arthur arrived at the estate just as dawn was breaking. The house was exactly as he had left it. Disorganized tents and smelling of stale cigarette smoke from the guards stationed in the foyer. He walked past them without a word. He went straight to his study. The shattered glass from his outburst days ago had been swept up, but the stain on the rug remained. The desk was cluttered with unread files, missed messages, and frantic notes from his left tenants. Arthur stood in the center of the room, listening to the silence. For 5 years, Clara Ara had been the unseen machinery that kept this house and this empire running. She had insulated him from the petty squabbles, the logistical nightmares, the endless, exhausting details of ruling. She had allowed him to be the terrifying figurehead while she did the actual work of governing. He had called her a calendar. He had called her a secretary. He sat down at the desk. He pulled the top file toward him. It was a grievance report from Bennett, the capo handling the Southside distribution. Bennett was threatening a turf war over a delayed shipment. A week ago, Arthur would have sent men to beat Bennett until he learned patience. Arthur picked up a pen. He read the file. He checked the dates, cross-referenced the shipment logs, and calculated the margins. It took him 2 hours. He found the logistical bottleneck, rooed 3 trucks, and drafted a revised payment schedule that gave Bennett a slight concession while penalizing the transport company for the delay. He didn't yell. He didn't break anything. He just did the work. By noon, the study was quiet. The files were organized into 3 neat stacks. When Gregory tentatively poked his head in, expecting a barrage of insults, he found Arthur sitting quietly, drinking a glass of water. Take these to Bennett, Arthur said, sliding a manila folder across the desk. Tell him the route is clear. If he deviates from this schedule by a single hour, I will strip his territory and give it to the Moronis and Gregory. Yeah, boss. Fire the guards in the foyer. They're smoking indoors. It smells like a betting parlor. Hire professionals. Gregory blinked, stunned by the cold, bloodless efficiency. It was exactly the way Clara Ara used to issue orders. Yes, boss. Right away. Over the next 3 weeks, Arthur Costello transformed. He stopped drinking scotch during the day. He stopped raising his voice. When a rival crew tested his borders, expecting him to lash out recklessly without his right hand, Arthur didn't send a hit squad. He bought the mortgage on their front companies, foreclosed on their properties, and froze their supply lines using shell corporations. He choked them to death on paper. He became terrifyingly precise. He became the ghost of the machine Clara Ara had built. But at night, when the house was empty and the ledgers were closed, the silence returned. Arthur would sit in the dark study, staring at the empty corner chair. He had saved his empire. He was more feared and respected now than he had ever been. Yet he had never felt more entirely, profoundly hollow. He had learned her methods, but he couldn't replicate her presence. In Port Haven, the days bled into one another. Clara Ara settled into a rhythm. The Union boys didn't return to the marina. Miller's debt slowly became manageable. The fishermen learned to nod respectfully when they walked past the office. She was safe. She had won. But the victory tasted like ash. She woke up every morning at 6 a.m., her heart racing, expecting a crisis to solve. She found herself mentally organizing schedules that didn't exist, drafting contingency plans for wars that weren't hers to fight. She missed the adrenaline. She missed the impossible stakes. And though she would never admit it aloud, she missed the brief, fleeting moments when Arthur used to look at her not as a tool, but as a partner. On the 27th day, Clara Ara sat in her small apartment above a bakery. It was 11:58 p.m. She had her laptop open on the kitchen table. The screen displayed a complex series of loading bars and encrypted pathways. This was the deadline. The dead man's switch. In 2 minutes, if she didn't enter the override codes, the $50 million held in the Caymans would automatically release back to Arthur's control. She rested her fingers on the keyboard. She could log in. She could keep the funds locked away for another month. She could maintain the invisible tether between them, punishing him for the 5 years of taking her for granted, punishing him for the 5 words that broke her. I never loved you. The memory flared, but the sting was duller now. She remembered him standing in the rain on the porch of the marina. I tore it all down for nothing. The clock ticked to 11:59 p.m. Clara Ara stared at the blinking cursor. She thought about the man in the bespoke suit standing in the freezing rain, ordering his men to stand down. He had given her back her life, knowing it might cost him his empire. You don't own me any more, Arthur, Clara Ara whispered to the empty room, and I don't want to own you. She closed the laptop. She didn't enter the coats. She sat in the quiet glow of the street lamp filtering through the window and watched the clock tick over to midnight. 1,000 miles away in a dark study, A computer screen chimed softly, indicating a massive transfer of funds. Arthur didn't even look at it. Clara Ara let out a long, shuddering breath. The tether was cut. The money was his. She was finally, truly free. She leaned back in her chair, waiting for the relief to wash over her. But as she sat alone in a quiet apartment, listening to the rain tap against the glass, all she felt was the absolute crushing weight of an empty future. 6 months passed. Port Haven plunged into a bitter, unrelenting winter. The ocean turned a violent, churning slate grey, and the rain transformed into sharp, sideways sleep that rattled against the thin windows of the marina office. Clara Ara sat at her metal desk. It was 4 p.m., but the sun had already surrendered, plunging the room into the dreary glow of the overhead fluorescents. She finished balancing Miller's quarterly taxes, printed the forms, and set her pen down perfectly parallel to the keyboard. She looked at the paperwork. It was flawless. It was also utterly, completely meaningless. She had achieved exactly what she set out to do. She was safe. She was anonymous. The violent, high-stakes chaos of Arthur Costello's world was 1,000 miles away, locked behind a door she had willfully chosen not to open. Yet, as she stared at the neat columns of numbers, she felt a profound, suffocating boredom. She had spent 5 years playing chess against sociopaths, moving millions of dollars through digital labyrinths and orchestrating the survival of a criminal empire. Now her biggest crisis was a late shipment of diesel fuel. She missed the edge. She missed the razor-thin margin between life and death. You don't spend 5 years walking through fire and then happily retire to a lukewarm bath. The bell above the office door jingled. Clara Ara didn't look up immediately. "We're closed, Miller. The slips are frozen over anyway." "I know." The voice wasn't Miller's. It was a low, resonant baritone that bypassed Clara Ara's ears and registered directly in her bone marrow. She froze. The pen beside her keyboard suddenly looked very small. She slowly raised her head. Arthur stood just inside the doorway. He closed the door behind him, locking out the howling wind. He looked different. The immaculate, intimidating Italian suits were gone, replaced by heavy, dark denim, a thick wool sweater, and a rugged canvas jacket dusted with snow. He didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like a man who had driven for 3 days straight. His face was leaner. The arrogant, manic tension that used to permanently cord his neck was gone. In its place was a quiet, anchored stillness. Clara Ara didn't reach for the drawer. She didn't have the revolver anymore. She had thrown it into the ocean 4 months ago. "You're a long way from home, Arthur," she said. Her voice was steady, but her pulse was a drum line in her throat. "I don't have a home anymore," Arthur replied, walking slowly toward the desk. "I sold the estate. Too many empty rooms. Too many echoes." Clara Ara kept her face blank. "Did you lose the territory?" "No." He stopped on the opposite side of her desk. "I consolidated it. I bought out the Maronis. I fired Gregory. I set up a board of directors for the logistics fronts. The street operations are franchised now. No more turf wars. No more midnight meetings in basement. I turned a mob into a corporation." Clara Ara processed the information. It was exactly the restructure she had proposed to him 2 years ago, a proposal he had angrily dismissed as cowardly. You learned how to read a ledger, she noted dryly. I learned how to survive, Arthur corrected. I spent the last 6 months systematically destroying every part of my business that required me to be a monster. I made it efficient. I made it boring. He reached into his jacket pocket. Clara Ara's breath hitched instinctively. But he only pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He dropped it on the metal desk. It landed with a heavy thud. Clara Ara looked at the document, then back at his face. What is that? It's the deed to the logistics network, the waterfront developments, and the offshore holding companies, Arthur said quietly. All of it perfectly legal. All of it clean. He reached out and tapped the top page. I transferred 50% equity into your name, Clara Ara. Not as a proxy, not as a silent backer. You are the equal partner of everything I own. Clara Ara stared at the papers. The sheer magnitude of what sat on her desk was staggering. He wasn't handing her a job. He was handing her half a kingdom. I don't work for you, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I know, Arthur said. He leaned his hands on the desk, bringing his face closer to hers. The scent of winter air and cedar wrapped around her. That's why I'm asking you to work with me, or rule me, or ruin me. I honestly don't care which, but I am not leaving this town without you. Clara Ara looked into his grey eyes. There was no manipulation there, no cruelty, just a raw, terrifying vulnerability. You said you didn't love me. She reminded him, the words sharp as glass. I lied because I was terrified. Arthur answered instantly, not flinching. I looked at you that night, and I realized my entire life was sitting in your hands. I tried to break you to prove to myself that I was still in control. It was the biggest mistake of my life. He didn't reach out to touch her. He stayed exactly where he was giving her the space to choose. I built an empire that doesn't need you, Clara Ara, Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. It runs on its own now. You don't have to clean my messes. You don't have to manage my schedule. I don't need you to survive anymore. He swallowed hard. I just want you as my equal, as my partner. The silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute. Clara Ara looked at the legal documents. She thought about the endless grey days in Port Haven. She thought about the fire she had missed, and the man who had finally learned how to burn beside her, rather than consuming her. A slow, genuine smile, the first she had worn in half a decade, touched the corners of her mouth. Clara Ara stood up. She picked up the yellow pencil from her desk, snapped it cleanly in half, and tossed the pieces into the trash can. She reached for her coat on the back of the chair. It's freezing in here, Arthur, Clara Ara said, slipping her arms into the sleeves. She picked up the legal documents and tucked them under her arm. Let's go back to the city. Arthur exhaled a long, shaky breath that seemed to carry 6 months of solitary agony out of his lungs. He finally closed the distance, wrapping his hand around hers. It wasn't a grip of ownership. It was an anchor. They walked out of the office together, leaving the lights on the door unlocked and the ghosts of their past behind them in the cold. What a journey! From a brutal heartbreak in a dark study to a true equal partnership built on respect and hard-earned growth. Do you think Arthur truly redeemed himself by tearing down his old world to build one worthy of Clara Ara? Or would you have left the paperwork on the desk? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you loved this gritty, slow burn Mafia romance, hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow romance readers, and subscribe for more intense, grounded storytelling.